All right, so we've been doing the cross-development series for a little bit now, but every tool we've talked about so far uses its own toolkit on each specific platform.
GTK, Flex,
Qt.
correct.
It doesn't use the native interface elements, and most of the time, some of them, not all of them, needed a runtime environment also.
Right.
So this time, we're going to talk about REALbasic, and one of the unique things about REALbasic is that you can build it once and encode for Windows, Mac, or Linux, and it will use their native interface toolkit.
Correct.
Native code, no runtime.
No runtime at all.
So in this episode of an in-depth look, we go in-depth with REALbasic.
And of course, this episode is brought to you by GoDaddy.com. And you can check this out, a little bit of money off of your GoDaddy purchases. How much, Chris, can you get off?
Well, if you use the code Linux, Brian.
Oh, that's a good one. You get 10% off of any order you make.
But
what else can you do?
Don't forget about our code Linux20.
Oh, how much can you get on that one?
20% off hosting plans.
Say what now?
20% off hosting plans.
I just said say what now, and you just did.
20%,
Fantastic.
that's Linux20, Linux20 when you check out, or the code Linux when you check out.
You see what it is,
and you save
it's
some
a
money.
verification. You go to GoDaddy.com and you enter Linux, and they know you're significantly nerdy enough to be worthy of a discount.
And then that means
get it.
they give us some love because you're giving them some love. And we appreciate everyone out there that does that.
So some love over here, and then some love over here, and you have a triangle. That's a love triangle.
And who doesn't like a love triangle, Brian?
That's
All
right.
Let's get into REALbasic. All right, Brian, why don't you lay down some real basic knowledge on me?
Okay.
First of all, isn't basic like so old?
All right, we got a lot of things to cover in this one. This is a bit of this is an odd one, to be fair.
Because I've heard of, like, I think when I was in high school, they were talking about basic.
So now just the same, though.
Old
There's,
to me.
Basic is old, Pascal is old. Come on, C has been around for a long time.
Yeah, but it's
this
called
point.
basic, so it must not have very much functionality.
All right, so REALbasic, let's get this out of the way first, is a completely commercial, closed source, proprietary as it can get, development environment for Windows, for Linux, and for OS X.
And it uses BASIC, right?
And it uses BASIC. Now here's the kicker. It isn't really basic. They use the word basic, and some of the syntax, for those of you who have played around with BASIC, which, come on, every developer has at least a little bit, it is basic-ish.
My unborn
for some
son
of the syntax.
has used BASIC.
Right. However, it's more like Java, honestly, from a language standpoint.
What?
So it's an object-oriented .syntax language that has everything you'd really expect from a kind of a modern object-oriented language.
Okay.
That
seems like a good thing.
It's nice and object-oriented. It's object-oriented. The point I'm trying to say is that REALbasic is object-oriented.
Brian?
Yeah.
What's object-oriented mean?
That means you can create an object. For those of you who are not aware,
objects.
Look into object-oriented development. It makes things a little easier.
Okay.
So that's kind of a key. It really isn't. It's not your daddy's BASIC. It really is a fairly powerful language. There's nothing that you really couldn't do in the language that's being provided to you. And what's even more important is that when it compiles, it's not interpreted code. It compiles native x86 or PowerPC code. And that's very important.
That seems like good for performance.
It doesn't have the fastest compiler in the world. Like the results produced are not, say, necessarily going to be as fast as if you did it with an optimized version of GCC or Intel's compiler or even Visual Studio's compiler.
But it's still faster than anything that runs in a runtime like Mono or
For
Java.
the most part. Now,
for the most part?
Well, see, now here's the thing. When you create... Hear me out on this one. When you create an application, whether it be interpreted, such as in Java, or native, such as in C++, what ends up making a very, very big difference for most applications is the framework that you're using. Is how efficient is the framework. If you're doing something that says, let's say, draws pretty translucent circles on a screen, well, you want those circles to look good, and more importantly, not more importantly, but almost as importantly, is you want them to draw fast.
Yeah.
You don't want there to be a lot of flicker. You want it to be able to compute the radius of the circle quickly, these sorts of things. Now, if you've got a framework that isn't overly well optimized, it doesn't matter whether it's native code or interpreted code, it's still not going to be all that fast.
It's just a slow math.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So that almost becomes more important. Now, of course, compiling to native code is a major stepping stone there.
Okay.
You can theoretically be faster that way. I'm probably going to get emails about what I just said. But that said, that's my personal professional opinion on the matter. That said, most of the work I do is interpreted. So what are you going to do? Now here's the thing. So RealBasic is the first. It's not the only commercial one we've been talking about or are going to talk about. Of course, Qt Creator is a commercial product, but there is a free version available. Yeah. Now, Real Software produces RealBasic, which, not to be confused with Real Networks, that makes Real Player the video streamer.
Totally different.
Nothing to do with them. Separate thingies. Separate thingies.
Don't get confused.
Don't get confused, guys. Now here's the thing. If you run Linux, there is a free version of RealBasic available to you. It's called the Standard Edition.
Not open source.
Not open source, just free as in beer.
Now, it has some limitations?
It has some limitations. We're going to get into that in a minute. If you run Windows or OS 10, the standard version, well, it costs money. It's $100.
Okay, $100. $100.
Or if you're a Linux developer, it's free.
But hold on, it's $100 for Windows or for Mac OS 10.
Right.
But you can build... For that $100, you could like be on the Mac OS 10 and you could build Windows and Linux and Mac apps.
No.
Oh.
See, this is what I'm going to get into. All right.
That's confusing.
We're going to get into this right off the bat because RealBasic does have some really phenomenal features, but they're very much hampered by their licensing and their costs. So now I've said this before and I'll say it again. Commercial software is important. We need to be able to fund our development. However, there are certain things that are staples, that are the foundation upon which we build.
Yeah.
This is why I feel that Linux as a desktop is important, because we want to build from a common base that is flexible and open to all of us.
Not controlled by one party.
Now,
one
if you want to create an extra application, a tool, a game, etc., that is closed source, I have no problem with that because it's not part of the foundation upon which everything is built.
That makes sense.
Now, a development environment, well, that's kind of a rough one.
Yeah, I can see that.
I look at how Qt has done it, and I gotta say I like where Trolltech, Nokia are coming from.
They've got the free offering.
They've got the free offering, and they've got the commercial offering, and
sure.
they provide services around it, and there's open source available, and all these sorts of things. And I really like that quite a lot. Now, on the RealBasic side, though, it's all closed, and here's the pricing, just to make sure this is an even option for you before we go any further.
They have like 3 tiers.
They have 3 tiers. Now, again, on Linux, the lowest tier is free.
Right.
It's $100 for the others. And the primary difference between the lowest and the upper versions, and there are a lot of them, but the primary one is the lowest version can only compile for the OS that it's running on. So if you run the Mac version, it can only make a Mac application. Now, you can take that code, run it, and bring it over and compile it on Windows, and now you've got a Windows app.
Okay, but so I'd have to buy the Windows version.
But then you got to buy the
Mac
Windows version and the Mac version, and the Linux version's free.
So if I download the Linux version for free, I can only make Linux apps. If I spend $100,
you can then make Mac apps, and you spend another $100, you make Windows apps. Which, let's be clear, if the tool does what it says it does, and I've worked with it a bit, and we'll give you my personal impression in a minute, then that $200 is cheap as hell, because let's be honest, you pay a good developer $100 an hour anyway for outsourced development. So was that 2 hours of work? I mean, for a really great dev,
kind of seems like Bob's your uncle.
It's really not that bad of a deal. Now you go a step up, you get the $300 version, which is like a pro thing. They're actually calling it the RealBasic Professional, and basically what that does is that allows you to build from one platform to the other. So you can say be on Linux, and from one click have actually a Windows and Mac version built right alongside your Linux version. What was that?
Oh, you're developing on Linux.
You can develop on any platform
for $300.
For $300, and you get all of them.
And now
right.
you've got 3 platforms.
And it adds a few extra things. They add a couple of plugins to allow you better access to like things like Postgres and MySQL, SSL, these sorts of things.
AES, 128 database encryption. I mean, that's
right.
That's kind of cool.
Right. So there are without those sorts of features though, and those are very important features. Another feature you get with the Pro version, which is necessary for development, is basically what they call a container control, which in almost any other environment they call a view, or like a widget. Basically, your ability to create your own custom widget. So you can take a view, put a couple of buttons and a text field on it, and then use that repeatedly over and over again. Right. Obviously, this is something that any complex application or professional developer is going to need over time. They made that only in the $300 product.
Like a library of them. So you could just,
you absolutely do. Yeah, exactly. It's so you just do that over and over again.
Yeah.
So now then they step it up, and they created this new thing recently called REALbasic Studio. For $1,500. You get the same thing that you get in Pro, plus you get like better support, and
you get.
And with it you get like a version of you get the ability to run it on all 3 platforms, because the Pro version only gives you a license for one platform.
Oh, so you have to pick your platform.
And you pick the platform you develop on, and then you can compile for the other platforms.
They also say something called Profiler for code optimization.
Yes. So those are the other 2 primary features for
Studio.
For Studio is IDE scripting, which basically is necessary. It's basically like you can create like a good make file, so you can include copying in your resources, moving some graphics around, packaging things up.
Without spending $1,500, you can't
do that. Now, even with the IDE scripting in REALbasic, there's still no command line interface to it, so you still can't create a shell script or a batch file, etc., to automate your build process. Major problem. IDE scripting takes care of some of that, in that you can create your scripts inside of your project file itself, but it's not complete.
I got about 1,500 bones for that.
Seriously. Now the profiler is decent. Basically, it's it's a code profiler. So you run an instrumented build, a code profiling build,
and it does performance metrics.
It times it. Right.
Okay.
Now there's lots of tools available for Eclipse and Flex and Monodevelop. There's plugins for everything that allow you to do that sort of thing, and theirs works fairly well. So you can see where your problem spots are, where your bottlenecks, which functions are running slowly.
Can I ask you a question? Now this is a feature that's in the Pro version, which is $300, and in the Studio version, which is the $1,500 one. It's remote debugging. Does that mean your debug output goes to another machine?
Yes. So now this is what I want to actually talk about a little
handy,
bit.
Right? Is that
actually
that common?
It's phenomenal. No, it's not common at all. Okay. No, it has been done. And mostly it's a command line thing. You can do it a little bit with GDB. However, this is very, very cool. So you can actually let's say you're on a Linux workstation.
Right.
You want to try out the Mac version of your application.
Right.
You simply do a little project, run remotely, and then select your Mac. That's already set up. There's a little application that they call the Remote Debugger Stub.
Oh, cool.
And it
sends the code to that?
Exactly. It builds the Mac version, connects to the Remote Debugger Stub, copies the new build over, runs it remotely, and anytime you hit a breakpoint or anything, you can actually debug it and debug the information on your Linux desktop. That
seems really slick.
That's very, very cool.
Especially when you're doing Linux, Mac, and Windows versions.
It's absolutely killer. It's one of the killer features of REALbasic.
Do you know if they have that little debug client for Linux? So like if you're
it works for they've got the debug client for Windows, for Mac, for Linux. This is one of the good things.
That's nice.
For the most part, is REALbasic does have relative feature parity among all the platforms.
Okay.
Now let's get into that for a second. So now let's say you're over the hurdle of it's commercial, which is a big hurdle for some people. Let's be honest. And you're over the hurdle of the total cost, which can be prohibitive, especially at the higher level.
Like we said, if you're billing out
before I go any further, the cost is a yearly cost. It is not a cost per version.
And then that entitles you for every
update that happens in that year. It's a subscription model.
All right, but again,
say
you buy the $300 version, you could make that money back in 2 or 3 hours, depending on your bill rate if you're an independent developer.
Right, exactly.
And if you're working at a company, it's a business write-off expense, even still for them.
So it's really not that big of a deal. Personally, I don't view it as a deal breaker.
But you wouldn't see an auto mechanic arguing about having to spend really good money on some really good tools to work on his car.
No, you need the right tools, and that's just fine. We're gonna talk about more about some more commercial offerings later in the series, but this is just the first one, so this is why this is kind of coming up more often.
Yeah.
But let's move on. So the main good points of it. Let's get the good before I dive into the bad, which I have some. So the good points is, and like we mentioned earlier, this develops to native UI toolkits for each platform. If you build a Mac application, it is a native Carbon, not Cocoa, but a Carbon Mac application. Supposedly the Cocoa support's coming soon. On the Linux side, it's all GTK.
Oh, okay.
And it looks good. It's current GTK, so theming works great and everything. The Windows side, it's Win32 right down the line, and it works well. Now, of course,
so it looks like it belongs on each type
on each platform, and it is native
That's
code.
Big for Mac users.
And there is no runtime, so you don't have to install anything. You simply build your executable, build the application, and double-click it, and that sucker runs. Now, of course, there are requirements on the Linux side. You got to have the right versions of certain libraries and whatnot, the right GTK versions. But that's standard for any application anyway. But really, that is fairly phenomenal. That's a big plus. The downside there, of course, is because you're compiling and building to the lowest common denominator.
Right.
There, you have less flexibility.
Like we talked about in the previous episode. If some operating systems support three modes for a checkbox, some support 2.
Right.
The check, not checked, and the dash. Well, REALbasic can only just do the 2 modes because that's the lowest common denominator.
That's what's supported on all the platforms.
Now,
it could be better.
Does that ever impact you in a way that's more significant than a checkbox? I mean, I know that's kind of just off the top of your head, but is there ever a circumstance where you write an application and like that's actually prevented you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, really?
So here's a great example. Let's say you're on an OS 10. Let's give props to our Mac brethren out there. On OS 10, you've got QuickTime. Now, QuickTime is on every Mac, and whether or not the user has purchased a copy of QuickTime Pro, a developer can take advantage of all the QuickTime APIs to create the ability of editing and recording video and audio using the QuickTime APIs. Now, if we're creating a Mac-only application, of course we can do that. Those APIs are not there or have not been there until recently on the Windows side. And on the Linux side, they're getting to be there with GStreamer,
but it's not QuickTime.
But it's built differently, and it's not quite as flexible. Because the design is different on all three, now it's difficult to write something that does editing of audio and video on all three platforms. Whereas if you're using something like Qt, that's a little more doable. It's actually easier to do something like video editing in Flash and Flex Builder for cross-platform work than it is in REALbasic.
Would REALbasic just fail to build? Like if you called on specific Qt or QuickTime stuff, webcam capture, and then you check the Windows binary box, would it just fail to build?
If the libraries are not available, yes. Or if it's a shared library, it can be weak linked against it, which theoretically you can build it so that you say, if you're building for Linux, don't compile in these method names or something like that. And that's fine. And
it's a lot to keep track of.
It's a lot to keep track of. But more importantly, it's just simply not really super feasible. The same is true, let's say, of drawing routines. Qt provides some very powerful drawing routines, as does Flex Builder, actually as does MonoDevelop. And REALbasic's no different. It has a nice vector drawing graphics class. So if you want to create some of your own graphics, let's say you want to create charting software. It's a good example.
Yeah, I like charts.
Under OS 10, of course, you have a nice anti-aliased drawing. It's very smooth. Everything is very crisp and clean. Okay. Under Windows and Linux, you don't have that. It's all jaggedy and gross, despite the fact that under Linux you have Cairo and other drawing APIs available, simply because the real software folks haven't gotten around to implementing a little better drawing routines under Linux and Windows. So this is where the big problems with REALbasic come in. They as an IDE, it attempts to have feature parity for all features across platforms.
And that seems like if you're not Apple and you're just trying to do an IDE just for OS 10, That almost seems like a full-time gig to me right there.
It's a lot of work. So,
and now if you're trying to do it for all 3 platforms,
it is a lot of work. I cannot fault the folks at Real Software.
That just seems like a task.
I know quite a few of them, at least some of the ones that used to be there, and good folk, great devs. But it's a lot of work to do. Another great example is there is an HTML viewer within RealBasic. Yeah, so now creating, let's say, a web browser in Mono or Qt is very, very simple. You drop something that's essentially a WebKit, a view, onto a window,
and it just
throw on an
edit
field.
WebKit engine, right?
Right. In Qt, yeah, it includes your own WebKit engine. Actually, the same in Flex Builder. You can drop your own WebKit engine. Right. It's very simple to create in a couple of lines of code a full-featured WebKit-based browser.
Right.
Under RealBasic, if you drop in the HTML control, it's fairly full-featured. It's missing some things. It uses IE under Windows.
Right.
It uses Safari's WebKit under OS X, and under Linux, it uses libgtk HTML, which is old and doesn't even really do HTML 1.0. There's no Java. Well, no, you can't render a current web page in it. You can't.
Oh, really? It's totally. Oh, I thought it was still going.
You can barely render Google in it. I mean, it's not. Obviously there's no Flash plugin. There's nothing like that, and it's HTML 1.0. It's Mozilla days of. I mean, we're talking.
I thought the only thing libgtk was used for anymore is to like render an
online help or
email
something.
client window or help.
That's pretty much the gist of it. Now, so that's a downside.
And so, can you say, do you have the power to call to something else, or are you just stuck with libgtk?
Now, of course, in RealBasic you can do declares and create plugins to create that functionality for you.
The purpose
but then you're defeating the purpose. You're not creating a true cross-platform application. And actually, this is quite funny. If you go grab the free version of RealBasic and then load up the language reference that's built into it, on the Windows and Mac side, it actually looks really pretty. They did a nice job of it. It's searchable. It's organized in a nice tree structure. It's phenomenal. It's one of the greatest online language references I've seen for a dev environment.
Okay.
On the Linux side, you go to it, it looks like a jumbled mess.
Really?
It is. There's no theming. It's just this white thing with text
They're
that's laid out weird. They're using libgtk. That's just it.
That's too funny.
So now here's the kicker. RealBasic, the IDE, is built in RealBasic.
Right.
That's kind of cool. So they actually are building themselves in themselves.
Okay.
That's kind of neat.
I like that.
Which is not quite as cool as Lazarus, but we'll get into that next episode. So that's very cool. However, again, if you're looking at feature parity across platforms, you don't have it there. You've got if you're making, let's say, a web browser, no, you can't make the Linux version. You're doing a drawing application, really, unless you jump through a lot of hoops, you're really just making it for a Mac. You want to do video or audio editing, you can kind of do declares and maybe make it work on Linux or maybe make it work on Mac, but that's about it. There's a lot of things like that where it just kind of makes you stop. And if you're creating a basic, simple application that's, say, a database front end, or you're willing to do a lot of the rendering and UI stuff yourself, it'll work fine.
I see.
But if you're not, it's going to present some significant roadblocks to you delivering that finished product.
That's too bad.
It really is.
What about, we talked a little bit about video stuff. What about 3D stuff? Does it only do OpenGL because that's on all 3 platforms, or can it do... Does it do like OpenGL for Mac and Linux and then DirectX when it's on Windows, or how does that work?
There's the thing. Okay, so now RealBasic does have a series of controls to try and make plugins, try and make game development easier.
Okay. Are there very many games written in RealBasic?
No, not really at all. Mostly just from the hobbyist perspective. You know what I mean? There's a couple of probably shareware games out there written in RealBasic, but nothing big that we would recognize.
Okay.
Now,
there's actually a couple of big games, not the entire game, but a lot of the front end of the game written in Mono.
Yeah, and a lot of games are using Mono for the scripting. Like Second Life uses Mono for scripting. But I digress.
Yeah, sorry.
But RealBasic offers something called like a Sprite Control that basically makes it easy to create like 2D kind of shoot 'em up Sprite kind of game. So you can create a cool little Sprite game pretty easily. Okay. That's kind of cool. Nothing big.
Now, is that OpenGL?
No. It's all 2D. It's not hardware accelerated at all. Nothing like that.
I see.
Now there is a 3D control that they have called RB3D, which actually sits on top of something called Kesa. Now Kesa is a free project that is essentially like a re-implementing of Apple's QuickDraw 3D. I kid you not.
QuickDraw 3D?
QuickDraw 3D.
Isn't that like
from like the mid 90s. Yeah, and early 90s.
And how does that work?
So Apple kind of abandoned QuickDraw 3D. This was one of those technologies that Apple said this is the future, and everyone doing 3D has to do it this way or die. And then like a year later, abandoned it. That's weird. When does that ever happen? But a lot of people said, hey, you know what? QuickDraw 3D has a good API, and it did for doing 3D stuff. It had a good API. So let's make an open implementation. The open implementation sits on top of OpenGL, provides a set of APIs and objects to work with, like 3D objects and 3D scenes, that's similar to QuickDraw 3D.
So you're writing to Kesa?
Yes.
And Kesa calls to OpenGL.
Yes.
Oh.
Now it's not optimal, and in fact, it doesn't actually work all that great.
Well, it would seem like first of all, your first wall is going to be whatever Case has gotten around implementing that OpenGL supports.
Right, and the reality is, it's not all that much. It's a very low common denominator sort of a deal where you're going to be able to make a 3D application, and you can make a 3D game that looks pretty decent, but not great. You're not going to make anything cutting edge here, and RealBasic's layer that sits on top of that is very easy to develop against. If you're looking for an easy way to play with like a 3D object and spin it and move it, super simple to do. However, lots of clipping issues, lots of frame issues, problems with it not working on various distributions of Linux, problems with it not working fully on Windows quite right, lots of random stuff. Basically, it doesn't feel fully supported on the various platforms. I do not know what their plans are for that, but if it worked great, it would be awesome.
That's too bad. The reason why I was asking that question is I know of a school district that wanted to do some really easy 3D game development.
Yeah. And honestly, it's probably the easiest 3D game development there is, but you're not going to do it cross-platform in a commercial way right yet. Yeah. And I don't know if it ever will get there.
All right, so it's not for gaming, but...
It's not for gaming, but it does have some cool tools. Now, if you are on the Linux side of things, obviously you can use all the 3D stuff in the standard free version. So if you want to just try it out and muck around with it, that's totally fine. Honestly, the fact that they give the free version away on the Linux side is one of the coolest things about RealBasic in my mind. It is a fantastic tool for quickly whipping out tools.
Because even if you developed an application in the Linux version, you can take that code that you developed and you could move it to a Windows version down the road and build it for Windows.
Right. It's still there. The code, for the most part, will still work unless you're calling out to the shell
or
whatever.
If you're writing the Windows version... You could move over to Linux, and now you could develop a Linux. You could produce a Linux version of your app.
Exactly.
That is really cool.
It's very, very cool. So there are some great things. I'm not overly thrilled myself with the fact that there are so many things that do not work quite right between platforms. If you stick to the most basic things and do your own kind of advanced rendering yourself for certain controls and things like that, you can get away with quite a lot. And it is nice, again, to be able to distribute an application without any runtime requirements, really, or
native UI.
It's easy to build installers that way. It's much easier than doing it with Mono. It's much easier than doing it with Flex Builder, although Flex Air application's fairly easy to distribute now too.
But with both those things, with Mono and Flex,
you gotta get the runtime.
Not native UI either.
Right.
And the native UI can be really big.
It's a big deal. I mean, heck, even in RealBasic, you can get a native GTK toolbar. And, you know, while that may not seem like a big deal, when you're talking about, well, coming from Java or Qt, it's nice to be able to finally do that.
And it's big in terms of usability.
Themable. It's going to respect all your system themes.
That's very nice, too.
So it is very nice. It definitely has a lot of pluses. And, you know, we've talked about in the past. In fact, we had a gentleman from Real Software on. He's not with the company anymore.
When the Linux version was new.
When the Linux version really first kicked off, and it has come a long way. It's a lot more powerful than it was before. When it first came out, it was pretty buggy. Now it's pretty stable for the most part, but it's missing a few features. Okay. So it may be worth checking out.
All of even the expensive versions have demos that you can download and try.
Yeah, yeah, they have like 30-day demos or something along those lines. So download it, give it a shot, try it out. If it saves you time, why not use it?
Yeah.
You know, I'm gonna refrain from giving my full and final verdict at the moment. But let's just say download and try it out. And then, of course, you might want to also look at Qt Creator or Flex Builder or something else. If you're worried at all. Do I need to cough into the microphone anymore?
So that's your look at REALbasic.
But here's the thing.
I think
here's the thing. It is
something to consider.
The company itself is worth a shout out. They have pulled off quite a bit. They started as a Mac only company many years back.
This is a huge amount of work to bite off.
It's a huge amount of work. They're really creating a project, and let's be clear. What they are trying to accomplish here is bigger. It's bigger than what the mono developed team is trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
It's huge. I mean, they're trying to take on something that's to the level of what, say, the Trolltech and Nokia guys are trying to take on, and I can almost assure you they've got a bigger team with a bigger budget. And what they've accomplished
They're trying to do it in a way. I think that if it's right for your type of application, the native app
is nice.
Native code without interpreter.
Yeah.
That's big.
And if you're coming from the point of view of using Visual Basic, this is going to be a little bit more comfortable for you. Oh. So it'd probably be an easier sell. I think there's even a Visual Basic converter where you can take like an old Visual Basic 6 project and try and convert it to REALbasic and then make it a few more tweaks and it'll run.
VB6?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot of business apps that still run VB6.
That's true. That's a good point.
So that really is the business case for it in my mind is all those old applications.
That's a great use,
those crusty old applications that were developed wrong to start with.
Yeah.
And
you gotta
VB6.
do something with them.
Yeah, exactly. Your business relies on them. At least try to get them to something more modern.
Boy, if you stuck around the video for that long, that's a golden nugget right there.
Nugget just for you. All right, so that's fantastic. Next video up, we're going to be talking about Lazarus, which has a lot of similarities to REALbasic, but is kind of an open source, hobbyist more of a thing. But definitely worth checking out if you're a Pascal guy.
Okay. All right, well, that wraps up this episode of an in-depth look. We just looked at REALbasic.
So we sure as heck
did. If you haven't caught our other episodes, we go into Qt Design Creator.
Shame on you.
Qt Creator. What is Flex Builder? We just got done looking at Mono Develop, so if you haven't caught those episodes, go check those out too.
Back in time.
It's a whole series. If you have any questions, any comments, please hit us up on Twitter. I'm twitter.com.
I'm Bryan Lass at twitter.com. I don't know what he is.
Chris Lass. Chris Lass.
I just cut him off. Boom.
All right, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.
Killed it right there.
This episode of An In-Depth Look is sponsored by GoDaddy.com, the world's largest host and domain name registrar. If you're ready to make an impact online, GoDaddy.com has got you covered. Domain names as low as $1.99, plus world-class hosting with unlimited disk space and bandwidth. Do-it-yourself website builders, dedicated servers, and SSL certificates, and so much more. Plus, as an in-depth viewer, enter promo code Linux20 at checkout and save an additional 20% off any 1, 2, or even 3 years website hosting plan. Some restrictions apply. See site for details. Get your piece of the internet at GoDaddy.com.